Good morning and welcome to the TC Dojo. The TC Dojo is a TechCom community that is driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn, you choose the topics, and we find the experts. In the TC Dojo open session today, we are lucky to have Tom Johnson as our visiting dojo master. Tom is well known as a leader in the technical communications world. He's best known for his I'd Rather Be Writing blog, where he has tackled, discussed, published courses, and shared his experience on a wide range of technical communications topics. He's a working technical writer right there down in the trenches, always trying new technology, techniques, and processes. To me, it's one thing that's always stood out. He never stagnates. He doesn't stop learning, and what's more, he always shares what he's learned. In addition to all of that, he serves on the council for the technical STC for Silicon Valley and Write the Docs in San Francisco. And he's been a workshop leader at TC Camp, and he was teaching how to document REST APIs 2 years ago. We're thrilled Tom has agreed to join us today. He wants you to ask your questions as you go, so be sure to type them in the question window as they occur to you. If you want to ask your question directly to Tom, just put that in there. I'll unmute you when he reaches the next natural break. All right, Tom, I'm going to pass presentation to you, and it's all yours.
All right, welcome, and thanks for joining this this presentation on Swagger. I was talking with Liz before we started about the popularity of Swagger, and I was looking at some analytics on my blog the other day, and the top pages are all about Swagger. Realizations using Swagger, tutorials on using Swagger. It's just a very, very popular topic, and it continues to be so. In part, that may be because there's people are searching for better documentation and information about it, somewhat new, but it's also just a really cool way to document your REST APIs. So we're going to dive into that. And I want to start by telling a little story about how I've sort of witnessed engineers working. But before I do, there is a written version of this presentation you can get at this link. This is part of a larger API doc course on my site, so feel free to click that. And you can get these slides at I'dRatherBeWriting.com/file/swagger slides. So a while ago at a previous company, we had a new release for our API, and the product manager was putting together some careful slides. He was outlining all of the new features, the new endpoints, the responses, and he actually it was a woman. She had lots of like tables that showed the code that was returned, other slides that showed the endpoint, and she walked these field engineers, through all the different slides. And as soon as the sort of presentation ended, what the engineers wanted was to try these things out. They didn't just want to see slides. They didn't want the static experience of, oh, this is how things should happen. They wanted to see it actually work. They wanted to push the buttons. And this is typically what engineers really like to do. They want hands-on experiences where they get to explore something and see how it works. And that's really what Swagger allows you to do. It's not a static experience. You are seeing an API in an interactive way where you can try things out, you can put in values, and see the responses right there in the browser. So it's much more immediate. What is Swagger? Swagger is a specification format for describing REST APIs. If you think about specification formats, it's helpful to make an analogy to DITA, right? DITA is a specification format for describing help content. It has certain elements that have to be arranged in valid ways, and then different tools can parse those elements and render an output. In the same way, Swagger has different elements. In this case, they're objects with different nesting and different details that you details in the way you arrange and present those objects, and then different tools can parse that spec and generate out different displays. So Swagger isn't just a single display. There are many different display frameworks that can read your Swagger spec and output it. And I want to note that Swagger is actually the former name. It's what most people know it by, but it's now called the OpenAPI specification. It was adopted by the Linux Foundation to be more of an open standard, and they renamed it. So here's an example of a Swagger spec. The pet store demo is the typical Swagger demo that you'll find, and this is the spec behind this pet store demo. You have a paths object that contains an endpoint. In this case, the endpoint is /pets, and then there's a get method, and you describe it. And this syntax here is in something called YAML, which is YAML ain't markup language, or YAML ain't another markup language. So basically, there are no markup tags. There's no angle brackets here. It's all space sensitive and space dependent. So 2 spaces below sets another level, and you've got the colon to indicate children below that level and so forth. You've got lists and so forth. You specify the parameters of your endpoint here, and there's very specific names that you use, and this is all laid out in the documentation for Swagger, which I'll get to a little bit later. But basically, this is the spec file. It can either be in YAML or JSON. YAML is actually a superset of JSON, so it's the same family. You can easily convert from one to the other, and the display frameworks read either. All right, so when you're writing all this spec, you really want to make sure that you've got valid syntax. So the Swagger team developed something called the Swagger editor that looks like this, and it essentially allows you to validate your content. It tells you if you've got an error. So for example, if I start messing this up, the spacing, it says, look, you've got some kind of bad indentation at line 26 or at a certain line. And this can be helpful. It's also a little bit frustrating because it's so easy to mess it up. But it's better to go little by little and address the errors rather than to try to address them all at once, because this validator will read from top to bottom and indicate errors. So you could have more errors down below that it may not get to until it gets to that point in where it's reading things. So this on the right shows you, it doesn't actually show you what the Swagger UI will exactly look like. You'll notice that there's some expand and collapse kind of functionality around the parameters, but this does show you more or less what it will look like. And again, this is the pet store one, which I'll get into a little bit later. Okay, there's a couple of different approaches you can take to creating your Swagger spec. You can either do it manually. You can open up your text editor or go to that Swagger editor and just start manually creating your spec, describing each of your endpoints, the different parameters, and all the responses and things like that. Alternatively, you can also automate it, which is I put that in quotes because it's a little bit of a false term. It's not as if you're automatically creating documentation. It means you put annotations in the programming source code, and then there are different code libraries that will generate out the spec file from those annotations. So with the automated way, what you'd have to do is work in the programming source code in order to add all of this information, the description of each endpoint, and whatever other parameters are included, and then you would generate out the spec file, and then you could do something with that spec file. Engineers often like the automated method because it sounds like they don't have to write any documentation because it's automated, but that's really not the case. Okay, so parsing the Swagger spec. Once you've got the Swagger spec, whether you created it manually or whether you generated it from source code annotations, you've got to figure out what tool you're going to use to parse and display the Swagger spec. Remember, just like data alone doesn't do anything. You've got to have some kind of framework that parses and does something with it to render it. You've got to have some kind of rendering method here. And so the most common one is something called Swagger UI. So just keep in mind that's different from Swagger. Swagger UI basically will render your Swagger code to look like this, like the pet store. And let's go to that pet store. If you just search for pet store Swagger, you easily find it. And it's got this expandable, collapsible display. Wait for it to load there. Where you expand stuff and you get more details about it. And developers kind of like this because it gives everything in one view. It allows you to see the whole shape of the API just on the same page, and it gives you a sense of what all you can do in the API. So that's nice. I mean, you're not bouncing around from page to page to page. There are some other frameworks that you could use besides Swagger UI. There's a variety. Appaji is like another platform that can render your spec using its own display, mass shape, README, RESTlet Studio. There's lots of different options. Just like with Dita, you've got a dozen different vendor CCMSs that can take and display the content, and each framework has a different kind of features. So this is really the power of having your REST API described in an industry standard specification, is that many different tools and frameworks can render it and work with it. Whereas if you just had it in your own description format, then you really are limited to whatever specific tool you design that for. So let's see how you actually use this display framework. It's actually not as intuitive as it kind of looks. Let's open up the pet, and it shows you that the parameters for this endpoint are, there's a body parameter, and here's a sample value of what you would put in this body parameter. The unintuitive part is that in order to populate this field here, you click in the yellow here. So now I've got the body parameter here, and let's customize it with sample ID. We'll put 5/8 there, whatever. Want something I can remember. And we'll call this name Bentley. I have a cat named Bentley. So I'm going to create my pet, and there are no other parameters except for this request body parameter. Sometimes if you have parameters that appear in the endpoint, which would be a query string parameter, then you've got more fields here. But this is just one request body parameter. Now, the magic button, try it out. It shows you the same request that you could send using curl. So I could open up the command line and just paste this in. You can see that it's following curl format with the request body here. And then here is the response. This is what has come back. It has created a pet. Now, in order to really see that it actually did create a pet, I'm going to use my get method to search for my pet. All right, so my pet ID was it 4/8 or 5/8? I can't remember. We'll try 5. And we'll try it out and see if we get Bentley. Yep, Bentley has been returned as my pet. So that is kind of just how you try things out. Now, I'll talk more about this later, but as people are exploring, they may not realize that they have just created a real pet in their own data. And this could be a problem if later people are ready to start for real, and they suddenly have all these pets that they have to then remove and delete, get rid of all this test data. So that could be a concern. There's another feature here. You'll notice in the top there's this explore. This is the path to the actual spec file. If I were to open this up and go to this, you can see that it's just the JSON that is the spec. Could be YAML as well. You can actually paste in another file as well, and we're going to do this here. Here's another Swagger sample. I did this as a sample tutorial in my course, how to create a spec from a simple weather API. This is a weather API on Mashape, and you can see it's got some just basic endpoints, air quality, weather, and so forth. And I took that and arranged it in the Swagger spec syntax and created the spec, which is going to look, let me paste it right here. just like this. Very simple. It's got an air quality index endpoint and some others. And you could actually take this path to the spec and paste it in any one of these Swagger frameworks, hit explore, and now it's reading whatever spec you put in there. So now this is actually reading this spec. And if I wanted to do, for example, the get weather method, open it up here, and I'm going to put in some data points. It requires a longitude and a latitude. And click try it out, and it's going to return, oh, you know what? It requires another key too. I forgot about that. I'll have to do that on my other one. So I guess it's requiring both an authorization key that didn't get auto-populated as well. And that is not showing up on this one. Okay. Let's just try it right here. This is the one that's got the, and what was the other? 37. Okay. So now this one, I guess, has the key implemented, and you can see here's the response body. If you were to paste this into JSON pretty print, it would show it in a much more readable way. But you can see that it's showing this. All right, and if you want more info about how to set up Swagger, check out this API doc course. The basics, though, is that like if you want to set up Swagger in the most fundamental way, you're going to go to the Swagger UI GitHub repository. You're going to click download the zip file. I've already downloaded it. You're going to go into this. Inside the zip file, there's a lot of different files. The dist folder is basically the built distribution. So this is really all you need. You can pull out all the files in this dist folder and just work with them. If you wanted to somehow build the Swagger spec, the Swagger UI framework with your own customizations and stuff, you would work with the other files and do a build and so forth. But you just work with the built files. You open up the index file, and there's one parameter that you would change here, the URL parameter. Point this to your spec. So you can put your spec in the same folder, and then just reference it, probably be a YAML file or something. Then you can open this up in something like Firefox. I believe I already have it open. Yeah, I think Chrome blocks local JavaScript or something, but Firefox works fine. And you could test things out, and the try it out button will work, and you can see it in your browser. Otherwise, you can just upload it to a web server. Okay, let me crank through a few more slides here, and then we'll get to more questions. To learn the spec syntax, you really need to read the documentation. And the documentation is on GitHub. It's all on one page, and it's kind of a bear to get through, to be honest. I mean, it's thorough, it's accurate, but it takes some getting used to see how it's organized. Essentially, there are different objects. Get to it. Here we go. There are different objects, and each of these objects can contain different items here, and you just have to understand what formats are allowed and how it can be described. And so you'll have to sort through that. Give yourself a couple of weeks and look at a lot of samples, and you'll get through it. Another resource worth mentioning is Swagger Hub. This is a really cool site that provides sort of cloud-based Swagger hosting, team access. So if you want to have your engineers collaborate with you in the cloud about your Swagger files, you definitely check this out. There's free and paid options and so forth. It's a good resource. There are other specs besides Swagger worth mentioning. One is called RAML. So RAML is just another way of describing your REST API. And here's that same sample weather API, but with a different display framework. And here you open up different tabs, and you see the information that's parsed and displayed, and you can click get, and it also gets the response in a similar way. After I developed the Swagger documentation at a former company, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Everybody loved that it was interactive. It really functioned like a quick reference guide for users to see all the endpoints and the different methods they could use with them. Learning the spec and going through the Swagger documentation really informed me about the standard vocabulary for REST APIs. Everything from the names for each of the parameters for the endpoints, request body parameters, query string parameters. It gave me a vocabulary to describe each of the components in a credible way. And I think from a user's point of view, having the ability to try things out definitely gives them a better learning experience. It's a known design principle that when you allow people to think thoroughly about something and to try and analyze it, they learn better than if they're just reading in a static way. There are some downsides to Swagger. It works really well if your REST APIs are fairly simple. But if you have a REST API that has a really complex request body parameter, the display doesn't work very well. It's confusing. Getting the YAML syntax right can be difficult. It can be really challenging, and especially if you're creating this by hand, you'll get a lot of errors until you understand exactly what the right syntax is. Especially if you're describing the response bodies, you have to identify what each element of that response or the request is, and whether it's an integer or whether it's a string and so forth in the right syntax. That can be frustrating. Probably the biggest challenge is that once you have all of this Swagger output, it is somewhat redundant with your other documentation content. If you describe an endpoint in your Swagger spec, do you also describe it in your regular programming tutorials and other how-to guides? In a way, if you're clever, you could somehow single source the two, but really there's not a lot of good tools for doing that. Finally, the test environment is a real issue when you let people loose with Swagger and they start deleting things and creating things. They really don't realize that they're working with their own data. So you should set up a test environment so they don't screw up their own information. Common question I usually get is, how do I integrate Swagger into the rest of my docs? There's really not a good integration method, but here are some resources that you can check out. There's a Jekyll theme called Cart that has a quasi sort of look and feel of it. There's something called Spectacle, which is supposed to be able to read a Swagger spec. I haven't worked with it before. Bootprint Swagger to HTML. So there are some ways to sort of transform it, but what I've found is that you should look at Swagger as like a complement to your documentation, a sort of sandbox where people can play around with stuff. I'm sure you may duplicate your parameter descriptions and so forth, but it's worth it. It's something that users can try out. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions here, so let me see what all you have. I'm going to let Liz surface them.
We've had a couple. One, we've got somebody who uses MuleSoft, the API console, and I think you mentioned that one as one of the options. MuleSoft?
Yeah. Sorry, was there a question? Yeah, I don't think I mentioned that specifically, but MuleSoft is one of these big API platforms that does a lot of things, and one of them is that you can upload your Swagger spec into it, and you can add other documentation. So this actually overcomes this pain point that I was just talking about with integrating Swagger into the rest of your doc. With MuleSoft and some of these other platforms, you've got a space for regular how-to information, and it pulls the Swagger stuff in there as well. So if you're using one of those frameworks, great. Of course, they're probably going to be limited in other ways. I don't know if you can reuse content or validate links or something, but it is definitely a good option. And people like standards. They like it when documentation follows industry common look and feel.
Absolutely. All right, we got some questions coming in pretty quickly. Let's see what we've got here. We've got, will Swagger work with SOAP XML API?
Will Swagger work with SOAP? Nope. Swagger is just for REST APIs. It's not going to parse your SOAP APIs.
All right. What about, have you tried, Tom, have you tried merging Swagger with authored content?
Well, that was, have I tried merging Swagger with the other kind of content? No. That relates to this last slide. How do you integrate Swagger into the rest of your doc? I have tried to single source it from the same source, and I got a lot of validation errors in the spec doing it like that and just gave up. So what I usually do in my main doc is put a link at the top to like a interactive console or something, in case people, I don't think users may know what Swagger is or care. And that is the best way to sort of bridge them in my experience.
So we have a follow-up sort of question. What about wrapping reference information produced by Swagger into larger packets of concept and task information?
How do you wrap reference information produced by Swagger into larger concept and task information? I think you really, this is, again, relates to how you merge the two. I don't think the tools are really there. You could try the spectacle one and see, or you could render out the Swagger as HTML and import it. But really, I mean, I don't think there are good tools that will just take and read it. The readme.io is a site that is like an API doc cloud hosting sort of framework that I think tries to merge the two, but really there's not a good way to do it. There's not a really easy standard way.
All right, fair enough. Okay, here's one. I keep seeing both REST API and RESTful API. Are these equivalent?
RESTful is a way of saying that a REST API may not have all of the standard characteristics. If you look at like what makes an API a REST API, there are specific characteristics that it has to follow, and a lot of APIs hit like 80% of those features. So that's why you would call it RESTful instead of a REST API. But really, it's a small semantic difference. Nobody cares. Just call it a REST API, RESTful API, whatever your preference.
All right. Well, here's another one. Other sources of information, especially books and tutorials, that provide end-to-end overview of producing API docs. I'm guessing, do you have any?
Well, I'll call attention to, if you go to my site, if you go to API doc, you can get pretty good information about creating an API, a REST API documentation, and some Java API stuff there. It's free. There's also some courses on Udemy by Peter Gruenbaum. If you search my site for Peter Gruenbaum, you'll get links to them as well as some discount codes. You can learn about REST APIs in general from lynda.com as well. It's more of a developer point of view. There's not very many good tutorials on Swagger, which is why I think some of my pages on my site rank so highly. It's confusing. And especially if you're a tech writer rather than an engineer, trying to get everything correctly set up could be more challenging. Other than that, I don't have any good recommendations.
All right. Well, I will mention that the workshop you did at camp 2 years ago is on YouTube and probably on your site too, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. That's on REST APIs. And he mentioned Peter Gruenbaum, so anybody who is in the Bay Area or a short hop from it, you can take Peter's class live and in person and get to talk to him at TC Camp in less than 2 weeks. So I'll put that slide up at the end before we go, but if you're local or even close to local, the camp is Friday and Saturday, so you really don't even have to miss a lot of work or spend a lot of money to take that class. All right, here we go. Somebody's looking for information on the documentation to MuleSoft console. She couldn't find it. I will send that question to you, and maybe you can address it on the blog.
Okay.
Specific links. And then somebody else said, you mentioned MuleSoft API console could integrate external documentation, looking for links, and because they can't seem to figure out how to do that.
Well,
So
I
maybe
do.
you can
I did
that
play
question
around
too,
a bit with
unless
MuleSoft.
you've got something.
in my
early.
course. I can't remember exactly where, but really, what MuleSoft has is they've got this. I think it's called Any Connect or Any something platform. Log into it. Just do a trial account or whatever with MuleSoft. You can play around with it and upload your Swagger spec and do some other things. It's pretty rudimentary last time I explored it. Like you could create a new page and add content in that page. I don't think you're going to be able to do really fancy stuff. You can organize the page in your sidebar, that kind of thing. It's not going to give you any kind of like robust tooling that you might be used to in a help authoring tool.
All right. And that seems to be our last question.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this.
And if you want more information, feel free to follow up with me after. Those are my contact info. And I'd like to say hello to you at TC Camp if you're going to be there as well.
That's great. You've given us just enough to be dangerous, I think, and possibly less than dangerous, which is awesome.
Okay.
All right, so one more time, folks, in case you're wondering about TC Camp, this is the place to go. For the first year, we're voting on and asking people to submit topics early. You can get $5 off a workshop if you do that, and you can sign up for the API doc writing workshop today too. It's very soon, less than 2 weeks away. All right, thanks everybody, and thank you, Tom. It was fantastic.
Thanks.
I think we've all got at least a great place to start.
All right.
All right. Bye, guys. Thank you.